Hi students, welcome to HSC Biology and Module 5, Heredity. This is video number 7 and we're moving into some aspects of human reproduction, specifically looking at fertilization, pregnancy and birth. So I guess I should say at the outset that this is going to be a long video. I did consider whether or not it was worth just trimming this into a few different part A's, B's and C's. But I think what I've tried to do is to look at a range of different strategies more than anything else that you can use as you're trying to pull some of these ideas together. I've pinched some things from the textbook. And I'll point those out to you as we go along. But I think that's more important, is that you look at the different strategies for each of these different processes and look at which one of these is going to work best for you. Because it's such complex and because we've got to talk about hormonal control, particularly in the context of processes like fertilization, implantation, which is part of the process of pregnancy and development, and also birth, we have a lot of things to cover. And so there's no way I can cover this all in detail. What I'll try and do is give you a very quick overview of each of these sections, and obviously I'll look at them in a little bit more detail in class. So we're trying to give you some ideas about what success looks like when you're working through these activities. So as long as you can firstly define each of these terms, it's important that you can contrast fertilization, implantation, and various stages of human pregnancy, including birth, which follows. You should be able to list some of the hormones involved in the human reproductive cycle. So if you can start to link those hormones with the different stages, that would be an improved response. And then, of course, what we want to try and do is analyze all those changing hormone levels, see if there's some way of being able to follow the patterns, follow the cycles, and understand why each of these important chemicals are secreted when they are, in order to assist with the development of the fetus or of the changes that are occurring in the mother, or both. So the first thing to do, I guess, is probably just set mammal or human reproduction in the context of mammals as a wider group. We have looked at marsupial reproduction previously because I think it's a very interesting one. One of the things that contrasts human reproduction with marsupial reproduction is the difference in the gestation times. Gestation is that period between fertilization and birth, and that is very, very short for animals like kangaroos. They give birth to altricial young. Altricial is basically very underdeveloped young. And that means that they're not able to really do anything much for themselves, which of course we do as well. But for the kangaroo, it's like a little tiny pink jelly bean, and all it's got really is some little forearms to crawl its way up from the vagina to the mother's pouch and attach itself to a teat. It's suckled there in the pouch. The kangaroos often are capable of producing milk of more than one type for joeys at different stages. And also, I've mentioned previously that kangaroos can do this wonderful thing called embryonic diapause, which is basically stopping the development of the embryo if the mother realizes that conditions are not great, and then she can stimulate that to restart at some point in the future. So it really makes sure that the animals are taking full advantage of conditions when they're good and are not exposing their young to conditions when they're poor. When we turn to the human reproductive cycle, we need to have a look at a couple of important steps. Now, the menstrual cycle isn't one that's specifically mentioned in the learning intention that I shared with you at the beginning of this video, but it's kind of implied. And one of the reasons it's implied is because the menstrual cycle is basically a cycle that prepares for the receipt of a fertilized egg every month. And so when that doesn't happen, then other things happen in order to prepare for the next month, and so on. So this is a cycle, and I realize that when I share this information, I'm sharing it from a perspective that I haven't actually been through. And so there's probably quite a lot of you watching this that know more, certainly more of some of the specifics of this than I do. And of course, the important thing about this is to identify the different hormones that are involved, when their levels are high or rising or falling, and what the consequences of those are. So in this first one, we've got kind of a diagrammatic representation of what's going on here. So you can see firstly a picture of what's happening in the ovary itself. So women are born with all, well, women are born, babies are born, female babies are born with all of the eggs they'll ever have. And those eggs will develop one at a time. They'll ripen one at a time in response to hormones that are released from the pituitary. So what we find happening first is we find an interaction between a couple of these little hormones, the gonadotrophic releasing hormone and the follicle stimulating hormone. The follicle stimulating hormone is the one that in the blood will stimulate the development of a follicle. So basically the follicle is where the egg is, and a few things are going to happen to that follicle as this process continues. So you can see that once the follicle stimulating hormone begins to rise, so it rises sort of fairly early in the process, and that is going to stimulate the development of the egg within the follicle. At the same time, the level of estrogen, estradiol, is going to rise. And that rising of the estrogen levels, you can see, is also what is starting to contribute to our thickening of the lining of the uterus. So at around about the mid stage, the 14-day stage, is when we talk about ovulation, which is the release of the egg from the follicle. Now, once this happens, the egg is going to then move through the infundibulum into the fallopian tube. The follicle itself is actually going to stay where it is, and it's going to become something which we call a corpus luteum, and it is going to be releasing hormones itself at that stage. In fact, the hormone that it is involved in releasing primarily is the other sex hormone, progesterone. And you can see the levels of that are really, really high following the release of the egg. The other thing too is, if you haven't seen a diagram like this before, you can see this spike in luteinizing hormone, which is another hormone that is released by the pituitary. And you can see that spikes right on the day of ovulation. So that's when we're talking about the hormonal control of different processes. You can see that release of specific hormones are having effects in the body. The hormonal or endocrine system isn't as fast as the nervous system, and often it is targeted. It's not always for all body cells. Sometimes it isn't always targeted either, but often those chemicals have a specific response in a specific place in the body. And so what we can see is that the levels of estrogen are leveling out and dropping a little bit as we go through the second part of the cycle. The levels of progesterone are very high. This is where the expectation at this point is that the egg that's been released will be fertilized. The fertilized egg will start to divide and move through the fallopian tube into the uterus, where it will implant in the walls. And the actual embryo itself, as it's been growing, as it implants into the walls, releases its own hormone in order to maintain that thickness of the wall. If that doesn't happen, then you can see the levels of progesterone start to drop. Our corpus luteum becomes, it kind of decays, breaks down a little bit into a corpus albicans, and we also have both the levels of luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone both pretty much zeroed out at that through that stage. So obviously nothing happens, and then you can see that as we get to the end of our little graph that the levels of follicle stimulating hormone after the menses are going to start rising again, and we're going to go through the whole cycle again. So this is a cycle that's regulated by hormones that are either coming from the pituitary in the brain or from the ovaries themselves. So specifically from the follicle in the case of progesterone, and from the ovaries in the case of estradiol, as the egg is maturing and then being released by the follicle. So this is one way of looking at hormones, and specifically how they regulate the menstrual cycle. What about fertilization? Well, fertilization in humans is one of the internal fertilization methods that we've talked about in previous videos. And for humans are involved in a continuous breeding cycle. That is, they're fertile almost all of the time and prepared to breed. This is not the case for a lot of animals. A lot of animals go through a process that we call estrus, or being in season or on heat, which is a particular time of the year. And usually the time of the year that the females are in estrus is going to correspond with the gestation of the young to bring them out in the most optimal time of the year, which is often why you find a lot of babies being born around early spring. That's when it's at its optimum. You've got optimum growth. You don't have the heat of summer at this stage. Gives the offspring a chance to settle in. It's not cold like it is in winter, or snow covering the ground, or not a lot of availability of food. So the cycle's tied very much to the optimum time of the year for babies to be born. Now, that doesn't have to be just once a year. Some animals demonstrate a more periodic estrus, but then others, like ourselves, have this sort of continuous cycle, breeding potentially all the time. Hormones that are regulating these cycles are really the androgens, so specifically testosterone, and that's going to be involved in the production of sperm in the testes, and the estrogens and the progestogen, which is the example of which is progesterone, that we talked about with the menstrual cycle. That's basically how we get the gametes. So once we have the gametes, our eggs and sperm, we need to bring them together. And that's what the process of internal fertilization is about. It's bringing together egg and sperm. Ideally, this will happen in the fallopian tube. The egg will be released by the follicle. The sperm will be swimming up towards the egg, and fertilization will occur in the fallopian tube. Now, we don't want implantation to occur there because that causes major problems. We want the egg and the sperm to unite to form a zygote. Single fertilized egg. So now our 23 in humans, our 23 chromosomes from the egg combined with the 23 from the sperm form 46 chromosomes. That cell is going to start to divide to produce 2 cells or 4 cells or 8 cells, and so on and so on. And it's going to divide as it's moving through the fallopian tubes into the uterus. Before it does that, though, we've got some interesting little things that are happening. A nice diagram that's come out of your textbook, out of the Nelson textbook, which you can see that there are a couple of distinct layers around the egg, and this kind of important one here is the zona pellucida. And so once a sperm has been able to penetrate through that zona pellucida and reach the actual membrane of the egg itself, then a chemical barrier is basically set up to stop any other sperm from being able to fertilize the same egg. So obviously we want 23 from the sperm and 23 from the egg to give us 46 chromosomes. Another 23 from another sperm is just going to make the numbers too high, and the mother's body will just reject it. So she only wants one egg, one sperm. So therefore we have to make sure that that process is blocked. And again, it's a chemical process that stops that. Once that first sperm has penetrated the egg, the sperm's basically going to lose its tail, doesn't need it anymore. Most of the rest of the sperm is just its nucleus, nuclear material, its genetic material. That's going to combine with the genetic material of the egg to produce our zygote, develop into our growing baby. This is also from one of the Nelson worksheets. This is a flow chart, and flow charts are another nice way to try and show some of the processes that are occurring, where one thing starts and another thing stops, whether or not rising levels of one thing create falling levels of another, and so on. So implantation is the process where the embryo, it's now an embryo, a little ball of cells, is going to attach. Implantation is where the embryo attaches to the uterus, to the lining, to the wall of the uterus that's been previously prepared for it. So this little chart goes back a little step. So what it does is it starts with the secretion of follicle-stimulating hormone. We know this is happening in the pituitary, part of the anterior pituitary. It stimulates the follicle in the ovaries. That starts the process of maturation of the egg. As the egg matures, the ovaries secrete estrogen. The secretion of estrogen is actually going to inhibit further secretion of follicle-stimulating hormone. Now, it's not perfect. Occasionally, a follicle from each of the ovaries may be stimulated, and you may get more than one egg appearing at a time. We know that there are things like fraternal twins where that happens. But most of the time, the system works that we have one egg maturing. As the egg matures, the ovaries start to secrete estrogen, and so what happens is that we inhibit further secretion of follicle-stimulating hormone in the pituitary. We also have the starting of that preparation of the lining of the uterus to receive the egg once it is fertilized. So as the egg continues to develop, we get to a point where the increased estrogen levels are inhibiting follicle-stimulating hormone, but have actually stimulated secretion of luteinizing hormone from the pituitary. This is going to stimulate the release of the egg. You might remember from one of the other diagrams, we get this spike where the egg is released. So once the luteinizing hormone is secreted, that stimulates the release of the egg from the follicle. And that means that the follicle now is going to turn into a corpus luteum. And from there, it's going to start secreting progesterone. And that progesterone is going to maintain the lining of the uterus. So it's going to, having had estrogens rising to prepare the lining, now the progesterone that's coming through from the corpus luteum is going to maintain that. Now, from this point in time, two things are going to happen. Either fertilization is not going to occur. If fertilization doesn't occur, then there's no stimulation, there's no secretion from an embryo, and the lining of the uterus will be cast away. As that happens, the levels of sex hormones, the estrogen, progesterone, start to drop, and that also inhibits the secretion of luteinizing hormone. And that means that the cycle is going to go back and start all over again, as we saw in one of the previous slides. But if the egg is fertilized, then it will start from its zygote stage. It'll start to divide and divide, become a ball of cells or a large number of cells that will eventually become a ball of cells. And that ball of cells may end up reaching the walls of the uterus. And when it does that, it's going to secrete human chorionic gonadotropin. And this is a hormone that basically says there is an embryo now growing. It is going to take over the running of the hormones that are going to inhibit the casting away of the lining of the uterus, so that the pregnancy is maintained. This is just an alternative way of representing the information in terms of the flow of hormones within each of these processes. I think flow charts can be quite useful. Obviously, there's some more things we could add to this in terms of implantation is really just when the embryo implants into the walls of the uterus, but we could certainly talk about what's happening after that as the baby develops through the entire period of gestation. So another way of representing the key bits of information is to use a comparison table. So this sort of a comparison table, and again, I've borrowed from Nelson because I think a lot of the strategies, a lot of the resources that are in there show you a lot of different strategies that work really, really well. So now if we're going to go from implantation, move to the period of pregnancy or the period of gestation, then what we need is some of these other hormones that are here. Now, I think the reason that these tables are really nice is because if you see a cell in this table that is blank, you know it's missing information. So it's a really good way of organizing the information to make sure you don't miss any individual detail. So we can see here maternal thyroxine, we can see insulin, we can see human chorionic gonadotropin, which I talked about in the last slide, insulin-like growth factors, and glucocorticosteroids. And these are all hormones that are involved during pregnancy. Now, not all of them are secreted by the mother. You can see that the mother is involved in the secretion of some of these, but the baby is also, the fetus, the developing embryo, to say don't cast the lining away, are also part of the source, if you like, of the secretion of these hormones. So we need to pair these up correctly. The active period during pregnancy is probably useful, but I think in terms of the table, we don't necessarily need it. What's more important is the effect, I guess, the effect on the mother and the effect on the baby. So these are the two things that are most important parts of this table. So when this hormone is released into the bloodstream, what's it doing in the mother's body? What's it doing in the body of the fetus? So you can see some of these, for example, the developing embryo, which is secreting this HCG, is basically about maintaining the corpus luteum, maintaining the endometrium, ensuring that the baby has a place to grow and is not going to be cast away. It doesn't really have any effect on the baby, it's just maintaining its environment. Whereas to look at something else, such as, for example, the maternal thyroxine. So the mother's thyroid gland is going to secrete thyroxine from about the 12-week stage. What's going to happen is that in terms of the pregnancy, low levels increase the risk of detachment of the placenta. So this could result in a miscarriage. In the baby, low levels result in low birth weight and immature lungs. So different parts of the body are going to develop at different times. Certain chemicals are very, very important, either in the diet or as supplements for the mother. And each of these are, you've probably seen a lot of information about the types of foods and or supplements that pregnant women are advised to have at least as part of their diets. So I won't go through each individual cell here because you can read them all for yourself. But what I encourage you to do is to set up these sorts of comparison tables I actually really like. And you can add to these, of course. We haven't put the sex hormones in here at this stage, the estrogen and progesterone. We haven't put hormones that have been secreted by the pituitary, like the follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, and maybe giving yourself a nice big table with all of these hormones listed, specifically where they've come from and what effects they're going to have on the mother. And this can be pre-pregnancy, obviously, if it's part of the cycle that doesn't actually lead to pregnancy. You can still include them on this table and identify that there'll be no effect on a fetus because there isn't one, or because there isn't a fetus, or because there isn't an effect. So that's why I think these are really useful, these tables, for you to have a look at, have a bit of practice in setting up, and also having a bit of practice in extracting information. It's unlikely you're going to be able to memorize definitions or large slabs of paragraphs from the textbook. So if you get into the practice of taking information and putting it into little cells like this, it's enabling you to process that information, and it's more likely that you'll retain that then at a later stage when you need it. The last step is the birth stage, and obviously at birth, this is the time for the baby to be born, so it's going to be pushed out through muscular contractions of the uterus. The cervix needs to dilate. I'm sure you've heard that that's the case, and so the cervix needs to soften. So hormones like relaxin are actually part of that. Relaxin's been a pretty important player through the pregnancy as well, because relaxin's used to soften the muscles, which reduces their strength. And unfortunately, that's a really good thing for some of the muscles in the abdomen because it allows for that expansion. but it also has an impact on some of the muscles in the digestive system, for example, which can have some other unwanted benefits at both ends. Prostaglandins in the uterine wall are secreted in order to begin the labour process and increase the sensitivity to oxytocin, and levels of oxytocin rise in order to promote contraction and also dilation of the cervix, and later the expulsion of the placenta. At this point in time, the sex hormones, estrogen and progesterone levels drop, and a few other nice chemicals kick in there at a very, very difficult stage for the mother, the beta endorphins and the adrenaline, quite close to birth. And one other hormone that's important is the levels of prolactin, and they've been rising through the last trimester usually, and they're going to be stimulating milk production to nurse the baby. This is a lot of information. I'm conscious of the fact that it is. It's been a very, very long video, this one, and it is one that's going to need to be split up into different sections. So I hope what you'll do is just to pick and choose the sections you want to have a look at. Try and come to grips with those specific hormones that we need to understand, and maybe separate them into those little sections, either by using a flow chart, by using diagrammatic representations, or by using a comparison table. A lot of information. Thanks for staying with us. And as always, thanks for watching.